Hello everyone, my name is Will George. I work for the Canadian Sport Institute Ontario as a biomechanist. I work with Ryan Blair and the Canoe Kayak Ontario coaches, providing biomechanics and performance analysis support. I've been doing that with the Canoe Kayak Ontario group since around 2013, and I've been working with boat sports in general since approximately 2005. Came to CSIO in around 2010 after finishing my masters in the UK on the mechanics of boat sports, and I'm looking forward to giving you guys a presentation on the biomechanics of canoe kayak, with the main aim of this really to go over a lot of the underpinning physical properties or characteristics of why boats move like they do, to give us some underpinning information as we go into a presentation in the next couple of weeks on sport testing. So looking forward to going through this content with you guys. Canoe kayak really is a fascinating sport from a science point of view, I think, and I've been fortunate to work with a number of you guys already. So I'm looking forward to going over a lot of the principles that govern boat movement, to really make sure we're all on the same page about the underpinning information about what causes boat movement, and hopefully that will give us some really useful level of information as we go on to talk about how you would implement testing in general into canoe and kayak coaching. I'm going to try and keep this content as interesting as possible. But please excuse, this is the first time I've done a remote video recording, so could get a bit dry, I suppose. But the point about this is to keep to make sure we've got a lot of the what could be termed as, I suppose, boring information that is actually really critical to understanding what we're doing in terms of canoe kayak and technique work, to make sure we've got that down pat. So looking forward to going through this with you. So to go over the main learning objectives that I wanted to make sure we cover by the time you finish looking at this presentation in your own time, hopefully you'll be able to get through it properly by the time we do our online presentation for sport testing. But when I think about biomechanics and technique in canoe and kayak, a few of the things I really wanted to make sure we get across to you guys include: ensure you have a really good understanding of the current Canoe Kayak Calendar or NSO guidelines about technical paddling. There are things out there already, and you probably already know them, but it's important to make sure we go through them, through the guidelines that are already existing. Don't necessarily make up our own ones, so everyone's pulling in the same direction, and working from the same base as well. I want to make sure you understand the key concepts of the mechanical rationale about why a lot of those guidelines are there, because it's always helpful to have that underpinning knowledge to be able to explain it to people when necessary. Understanding key mechanical principles involved in the stroke and boat movement, which is kind of the same thing really, and understand their relevance. This is a really important one. Understanding their relevance to where they fit into the hierarchy of things that affect speed, and I'll go through that with you a little bit more as the presentation goes on, so you'll really understand what I'm getting at by that. But those are the key things I want to really make sure we cover today, or get through to you and make sure you have a really good grasp of. So looking forward to get into this stuff with you. So I've got a few links up on this page and the next page, because if you go onto the Canoe Kayak Canada website, and under coaching resources, there are a bunch of uploads there already, which Canoe Kayak Canada placed there as guidelines about how we should be paddling canoe or kayak. So I'm going to pause this presentation now, and we're going to whip over to those websites. And I'm going to get you familiar with what's there, just to, in case you haven't already, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay. So guys, as I was explaining, if we go onto the Kayak Canada website, resources, under coaching, you'll see there is this web page here, and it's got a bunch of resources on it for coaches. You can see there's a bunch of things down here that I would really recommend you dipping in. Like, I know Dr. Joe Peck is very well respected in the skill acquisition area, so that's really worth looking at. And so there's a lot of resources here that I would really recommend you taking a look into. But from the biomechanics point of view, there's these resources here that aren't exactly new, but it is important to make sure when we're talking about technique and mechanics that we do pull in the same direction as the NSO. We're not going off on a different tangent, as long as when we critically evaluate what they're talking about, it still makes sense. So I wanted to make sure that you knew this was here and that we can go on and discuss what they're saying. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull each of those resources up and go through them a little bit, not in great detail, but just to sort of pick out some maybe key words that have some meaning from a mechanical point of view. So I think we're going to start with canoe. So there's a few different resources they have for canoe and kayak. They have an illustrations page, technical template page, which is very wordy but sort of still does the same thing, and sort of a slideshow on the block. So this is a nice one-pager. You know, it's doesn't really get into too much of the mechanics. It just keeps it about how you should be coaching, I suppose, and that's fine. There's some key things in here that I sort of pick out, and we can go through them a bit more later because I really want to. I've taken some of the keywords out and put them into the presentation later, so so we can understand the physics behind them a little bit. So, for example, you know, they talk about twisting and straight arms, and yeah, bottom arm straight. They talk about A shape and triangles. They talk about power and submerging and sinking. So there's some terminology in there that I want to make sure that we really understand what it's talking about and why. There's the same resource for kayak, really. That's that one. And this is a very similar format, really. You know, it's pictorial. It's sort of it's specifically for coaching. So I would point you towards these documents to really make sure you're familiar with them. And as with canoe, you know, they also have some keywords in here that I'm going to dig into a bit later. You know, the same sorts of ones in terms of twisting and straight arms, and when an arm should be bent, and you know, when a paddle should be going in the water, submerging. You know, a bunch of keywords, and I'm going to get into them a bit later. But I wanted to point you towards this resource. The next one was you know, a wordy technical template. You know, you can see this was written by Scott Aldershaw in 2009. It's not very new, but that doesn't mean it is not relevant. And so you can see it's very wordy. And to the same point as the pictorial document, I've picked out a bunch of words out of here that I'm going to talk about from a mechanical point of view a little bit later in the presentation. But the main point is to show that this document is here. And it's the same with canoe, really. If we go to this was also written by national team coach Thomas Budai in 2009. And also, you know, pretty wordy. I think that's the point about it. But and they break the stroke down into different parts to help you work out how to coach it. And I've pulled a bunch of the words out here that we can discuss in the rest of the presentation a bit further on. Now, I'm not going to go through these documents and go through the whole stroke about exactly how you should be paddling from a mechanical point of view. It's not the aim. I really wanted to make sure you have a sound understanding of some of the mechanics of the stroke, so better grounds you when we talk about testing, because a lot of the rationale for this presentation is I started to put a testing presentation together, and pretty quickly realized that, if we're going to be talking about some more technical aspects, and the same goes for physiology, which you had that presentation recently. It was very good, thank you, Mel. It's important to cover some of those topics, so you had made sure you had that grounding in it before we even started. So next one was the block presentation. This also exists online. You can see the web address at the top. I would point you to taking a look at this. This is nice and pictorial as well. It really shows you, some of the body positions, and talking about that A-frame again, and what to do with body weight, and what to do with some different body positions. And I'll be talking about some of these concepts, some of the keywords I've picked out from seeing these later on in the presentation. I'll also show you the same one for kayak. Zoom out a little bit. So this is, showing the body angles and showing some of the keywords, and giving mostly a pictorial representation of what should be where. But as I said, I really wanted to just point out to you that these resources exist, and I would recommend you taking a look for yourself. Hi everyone. So now we have brought your attention to Canoe-Kayak Canada, or the NSO's guidelines on stroke technique, and in particular the resources that they already have online, to make sure everyone's on the same page and all the coaches are coaching the same way, hopefully. I really wanted to sort of dig into the next level and make sure everyone has a really good understanding of this concept of deterministic models, and that's going to really feed into the concept of sport testing. So deterministic models is all about inputs and outcomes, and sort of fancy words for causal factors of different outcomes. Because obviously in canoe kayak we are looking to have our average stroke velocity be as high as possible over the duration of the race. The person who has the highest one of those will win. So that's what we're looking for. That's our overall outcome. And there's plenty of different models of these ones. This is just one mechanical one done by one person in one study. I'd like to point out this is just a mechanical one. It doesn't include physiology, environmental factors, a bunch of other things, and therefore it is just a piece of the puzzle. But nevertheless, it's an important one to grasp and get your head around. This one is a bit of a more simplistic one, with boat speed at the top, and so a few different metrics, but a few of the same ones. Is this a little bit more exhaustive one? They go into physiology a little bit in there, but there's still a lot of mechanical ones in it. But the point is that what we're trying to do is point out as many of the things that go into or contribute and the causal factors of performance as possible, and put them in their appropriate hierarchy of performance. So what feeds into what. Therefore, you can understand where performance really comes from, and you can have this sort of in the back of your mind as you're looking at an athlete. You can see, you can see the different sort of average stroke velocity they have, but what's the cause of that? Is it because their stroke rate is not high enough, or because their stroke distance is not high enough? And then that feeds down into all of these different causal factors that are on different levels of level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, and all these different factors that then go into this terminology you've got for change in velocity during the pull phase, which is essentially changing momentum, and then that's power. Anyway, we can get into that in a minute, but the point is that we're almost like listing all of the causal factors that go into performance and see where they sit in the hierarchy of things, because then you can help break it down in your head into what's going on and what might be the specific cause of the best thing to look for into improving them. You know, it might be that for one athlete it's particularly this that's causing it, or for another athlete it's particularly this that's causing it. Oh, that's blade slip. Just one particular example of what might be limiting this overall average stroke velocity not being as high as you might like, or just constantly trying to improve it. So I really wanted to point out this overall concept that every aspect of the performance is just part of a hierarchy that in the end affects stroke velocity, and if you change one thing you affect another, and so it's all about inputs and outcomes and causal factors. So the next thing I really wanted to cover is a few key mechanical principles that are really important. They're pretty high level when it comes to performance, and a lot of them can actually be measured. So I thought it's really important that we have a little bit of a chat about exactly what some of these mean, to make sure that the terminology is really correct, and we can use them effectively in coaching and support provision. So some of the key mechanical variables, the highest one obviously is velocity. You know, we want the highest average velocity to be achieved over the duration of the race. Thereby, you're going to reach the end quicker. But a key thing to talk about here is that that's over the duration of the race, and therefore, if you change your perspective from average over the duration of the race to instantaneous, we can start to look at intra-stroke and what's happening within it. Because, you know, canoe and kayak are cyclical sports, and you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, cyclically, repetitively, for the duration of the race. So any change that you make for one stroke, that particular part of that stroke, you're going to be able to magnify that over the course of the race, and it's going to have more of an impact. So there's the average and the instantaneous part. So we want to have each instant as high as possible, thereby affecting the highest average. And to have an improved or raised instantaneous velocity, we're going to need to start looking at level 2. So this is where we talk about a couple of other physical metrics which some people have a good grasp of and some people don't. Getting into a little bit of Newton's laws is to increase velocity, we need to accelerate. And so there you are. I'm just going to circle that. You're changing your velocity, so we need to accelerate, and that will then change your instantaneous velocity. And in order to cause that acceleration, the two key factors are force and mass. Now the mass is controlled. You know, that's your body weight. It's the boat. It's the system. So therefore, we need to get that force as high as possible. This is what you put into the boat through the paddle and through your contact forces. Now you can see in this nice little description that's old now but still relevant. You know, your contact forces are the paddle, the foot stretcher, and the kayak seat. Sorry, and they can have different force directions. And then there's some other things that you can't really control so much, like hydrodynamic drag. These are forces that go into dictating whether the net system force is high or low. And that net system force is really what I'm talking about here. It's like all of the forces that that are happening when you're interacting with the boat, all amalgamated together, and they cause this force, which relates to mass, and then works into acceleration of the boat, and that causes instantaneous velocity, and which feeds into average velocity. So having the force direction and magnitude in relation to forwards, i.e. propulsive. Nice, that's not a very good arrow, but you can see, or or drag related, like resistance, going that way. It's all about the balance of those, because the net outcome from them is gonna be the overall force going forwards, which is this. As we said, that causes the acceleration. So the next sort of little level to cover here is level 3. This is a little more tricky to get our head around, but that's okay. So what we're looking to do is change momentum, which is basically change speed and then in relation to mass, but as the mass is already controlled, we're looking to change momentum. We're looking to accelerate. And the way we do this is we apply this force, and we apply it for as long as we possibly can of the stroke. That's why you want a long stroke, which means you're going to be doing it for longer, because what happens when you pull for longer is your impulse, which is force and time together, is higher. And impulse is change in momentum, which is us accelerating. Now another way to look at that is also power. So this is force times velocity. So it's the same force that you're applying, and it's and the force being the load that you can put on the paddle, and the load that you can then connect through the paddle into the water, and the load that you're putting on the seat and the footbar, and when all of those sort of combine together, and the pluses are amalgamated with the positive ones are amalgamated with the resistive ones, then we end up with like the overall force. But the force that you can put into the paddle and the speed that you do it at, and then for a longer amount of time, all amalgamates together to have a higher power, which is important, a longer impulse, and that affects the change in velocity and acceleration of the boat. So typically things that we could measure, like obviously we can measure the average velocity, because that's just something you can do with a stopwatch. We can measure instantaneous velocity and acceleration with some inertial measurement units, so things that you'd be familiar with, like spin units or something. Things are a bit more tricky to measure, but still can be done with the right technology, and some of the coaches will see we can do this. We can measure force on the paddle, and therefore we can also measure impulse on the paddle and power from it. Things we can't really measure, very tricky to measure, force on the foot stretcher or force on the seat. These are things that have been done in research projects only, pretty much. So I just wanted to point out that the reason that the power is important is because this is what overcomes the drag that is caused by the water. So it's important that we have this as high as possible so we can overcome that resistance. So hopefully we've covered a few of the sort of important mechanical topics there, that you will see some of that terminology come up, and it's really important to see where that fits into the sort of mechanical picture. And what I'm going to try and look at next is a couple of the key concepts that go into, I was talking about propulsion and resistance before there, and there's a couple of key concepts within those. So I'm going to explain them now. From my relationships with some of the coaches in the system already, I know for a fact that some have a pretty good understanding of this already, but that doesn't mean everyone does. And so I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about this, because we were talking about power and force before, and looking at the system as a whole, the overall propulsion versus resistance, what the water's doing versus what you're putting into the paddle. And so you can put as much force and power into the paddle as you want, but the way that that's then translated into the whole boat movement. So we put our force into our paddle, and then we have to make that translate into the the whole boat system moving forward. And so there's a key part of that, which is the propulsion side of it. So we're getting the force that we've put on the paddle, and we're getting that into the water. And there's a couple of important considerations here. So it's the interaction between the paddle and the water. Now, the one I've got there on the left, this is kayak, and the one we've got on the right here is more sort of, especially at the top there, because of the shape of it, I wanted to point out it's a bit more. I was trying to point out the canoe part of it. So when we look at the kayak, so as you've seen over time, kayak has shifted towards the wing blade in kayaking, and a lot of research has been done on that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Norwegians were first to do it. I know there was it was quite a while ago now that the first research had been done on that. But so here's your kayak boat. Nice little diagram of it, and the direction of motion is the main point. And here's your wing paddle with a very simplistic design. And here's your water flow. But the main point they're talking about here is the resultant force, which is locking the blade in place and stopping it from slipping, so that the blade, instead of slipping through the water, is able to lock into the water, and all of the force that if this was 100% locked, all of the force you apply on the kayak would get imparted into the water. The blade would lock, and it would all result in forward motion of the kayak, and you would use the locked blade as a launch pad to sort of launch forward from. So there's this resultant force of pushing on the blade to lock it in place. That's because the water's come from this. If the water's come from the correct direction and with the correct amount of force and blade burial, then you'll get two forces, one in this direction and one in this direction. And the resultant of that, the resultant force vector from that, is just in exactly parallel motion to parallel direction to the direction of the kayak movement. Therefore, you have a completely locked blade, and all force that's put onto the paddle, instead of resulting in, if the resultant force was in a different direction, then you would end up with a slip in the blade, and so some force that you put into the blade would result in blade movement rather than kayak movement. And so this water flow direction is indicating that you've speared the water in the correct direction in relation to the paddle, and therefore it's locked on. So that's a key point about propulsion in a kayak. And when we look at canoe, we're talking about a completely different type of hydrodynamic interaction, where the paddle gets submerged like this, and the way that it's enabled that the paddle gets locked on and the boat can launch forward from that is that drag comes around the paddle, causing those vortices, and it gets very difficult to pull the paddle through the water, therefore ensuring that the paddle moves as little as possible through the water, and the boat uses that as a pivot or a launch pad to go forward from it. So the water moves in a very different direction around the paddle, and we want to see that the water moves in an appropriate direction to resist the paddle moving through the water at all, really. So those are the key concepts that I wanted to explain or get forward with the idea of propulsion, because in the end this is all about propulsion against resistance. And now hopefully I can cover a bit more about resistance. So a few of the key aspects of resistance. Now we've got to remember that this, for the most part, canoe kayak is a hydrodynamic sport. That I suppose we're in an area where it's part submerged and part not. when you look at the density of water versus the density of air, water provides far more resistance. If I remember correctly, the number is 800 times more, although I'd have to look that up again. So a few of the key points of resistance, we're looking at friction, drag, we're looking at blade slip, which we already discussed a little bit, and we're looking at buoyancy, which sort of plays into drag, because the more buoyant you are, the less contact area there will be with the water, and the less drag from that. So when we look at buoyancy here on the left, we're looking at the water pushing back, depending on the density of the fluid. That's why it's important to note when you have brackish or salt water or fresh water, impacts that. And then the mass of the object pushing it down. This all affects how much of the boat is submerged. So body weight comes into it, minimum weight of the boat comes into it, and making sure you've got the correct weight of the boat. And so this all goes into affecting the wetted surface area of the boat. So we're going to ignore blade slip a little bit because we already covered that. We're really looking there, just very simply, we're looking at the amount of the stroke that's lost due to the blade slipping in the water. So for example, if you had a set amount of force on the blade for the whole stroke, and you spent the first X seconds or degrees of the slope with the blade moving through the water instead of the boat moving, then that would be called slip, and that is a sort of a form of resistance, I suppose. And the other ones are, buoyancy, friction, drag. So the buoyancy is really affecting, is like an input to the drag and the friction. So we're looking at the wetted surface area of the boat, and a few key forms of drag. We're looking at skin drag. So that's the interaction between the type of material that the boat is made of and the water. So what affects things like that? Bubbles, temperature, I think. So that's the friction of the water interacting with the skin of the boat. Form drag is really the shape of the boat. So things that go into that are like the frontal surface area of the boat that's submerged. So if you think about the cross-section area of the boat that's going to be coming into contact with the water as it goes into the water, as it pushes or scythes into the water. So the angle that's attacking it at, the overall frontal surface area of it. This is the shape of the boat, really, and the bigger that is, and the more less of an angle or more of an angle that it's attacking the water at, then the more drag there's going to be. And then finally, there's wave drag, which is important in obviously in water-based activities, and that's the interaction between the waves that are hitting the boat. It's a bit of a harder one to explain, but it's more of an awareness that these are the forms of resistance that we want to be making sure that when we're imparting force onto the boat system, that these are the things we're overcoming. And in order to make the boat accelerate forward, we have to make sure that our forms of input are propelling the boat over and above this resistance. So now I've covered a bunch of the basic physics about propulsion and resistance, and a lot of the terminology you've heard of and probably understood to more and lesser degrees. I also wanted to go back and closer to the start of the presentation, I was mentioning that in the nice CKC resources that are already online, that I'd been through them and picked out a bunch of terminology and words that I thought were important to discuss and go through and add a bit more mechanical rationale and perspective about why they're important. So here goes. I picked out a bunch of these different words, as you can see. So some of the ones that came up really quite frequently to me, excuse me, were straight arms or bent arms. And I wanted to discuss this because to me this really talks about force transmission. You see this top point here that I've got, I just mentioned force transmission there. Forces act in lines, and therefore straight lines and then therefore straight body parts and limbs are way more effective at transmitting force, not necessarily creating force, transmitting force, than bent ones. Hence, therefore, when we're pulling with our bottom arm in canoe, or for that matter, pulling with our bottom arm in kayak, we're not really using the arm muscles as the force production units, because they're way smaller and way weaker than the big ones in the trunk, that we're really trying to use them to transmit the force we create in other parts of the body to the paddle. Therefore, straight arms for as long as possible in the stroke, within reason, are important. Because if you think about it, sort of like a rope, they're pretty good at transmitting forces when you're pulling straight through them in a straight line, but they're not great at transmitting forces when the line's a bit wobbly. So the next topic I saw in the presentation and the CKC documents quite frequently was this concept of an A-frame for a strong shape. Now, anyone who can remember basic lessons at school will remember the different strengths of different shapes. So if you remember, the A-frame, which sort of turns out to be a bunch of triangles, is a very strong shape for rigidity and force transmission. Therefore, that's going to be much better at creating force and transmitting it. So we want to have that body position as much as possible, especially in the canoe area. Blade locked water interaction for propulsion slip. I think we actually covered that quite a bit already. I think you'll have a pretty good understanding about how a blade locked into the water is going to help the boat shoot forward from it, and that slip means the paddle is moving because of the incorrect orientation and interaction with the water, meaning the paddle is moving instead of the boat. Any topics here that we already wanted to recover a bit? So I'm just going to shoot to the bottom a bit because it caught my eye. We were talking about straight lines at the top for force transmission. This is also why the body rotation is important for kayak, because if you're rotating the body more, it means that because the paddle is moving, in order to keep in relation to the body, in order to keep the force production on the paddle, you have a choice. You can either bend your arms or create more opportunity for distance for it to move by rotating the body. And so it's much better to rotate the body and give yourself distance to move rather than break the straight lines of the arms and then start dealing with bent arm force production, which will tire your muscles out pretty quickly. The other reason is you can really use the muscles around the trunk for creating force, and they're much bigger and stronger. So that allows for two positive aspects, I suppose, really. Force vectors, seat and knee. Yes, my point here. Yeah, this sort of comes from the A-frame of a strong shape. When you think about the contact points of in a canoe and kayak, for that matter, when we're looking at the points where you're applying force to the boat and the paddle, and because we're thinking about all of these contact points because it makes up the system, you really need to think about what direction and force my contact points with the boat are applying at different times, so different times being drive and recovery. And so in kayak in particular, I like to sort of discuss what happens at the knee, because it's a really important position, and the foot for that matter, really important position for applying force. You know, you have your force going to the paddle, which is important, but the other way that the system provides force is through the feet and the knee. So you need to have a really strong connection with them. And so I like to sort of describe this this interaction with the knee pad is really important, because you know it's got those curves on it for comfort with the knee, but they also face in many different directions. So it's important that particularly when the athlete is coming forward to put the blade in, and during the power phase or the drive phase, that we make sure that the direction of that force from the knee is very much forward, not down and across, but it's going straight forward as much as possible, and really well connected with the feet, and can really squeeze the boat forward by, as you come forward and to the blade going in, and in the early parts of the power phase, to really squeezing that knee forward, using the correct posture and the core area. The other areas I wanted to talk about, pressure for blade burial. That's a really important one, because if we go back to the propulsion and interaction and slip area here, if the right pressure is not on the blade, be it canoe or kayak, for ensuring the blade is correctly buried, then the interaction between the water and the blade will not be as it needs to be, and the blade will slip through the water. So making sure there is enough pressure on the blade, whether it's using the body weight at different points, which is an important one, is really important for making sure the blade is having the correct interaction with the water. Like if you don't have the blade properly buried, or the forces on it and the direction of it to make sure it stays in the water properly, then the blade is not going to lock properly and is not going to allow for the boat to spring past it. So that's an important one about blade burial there. Whoops, I need a straighter line. Also, in the same sort of point as I was making about the force vectors with the seat and the knee, keeping the weight forward onto the paddle and not moving back really helps with making sure you're squeezing forward, so the force goes into the front of the knee pad, and that's very difficult to do when you're moving your body back. And it's also much easier to keep the weight on the paddle and keep it buried, and keep the interaction between the paddle and the water optimal when your weight is onto the paddle and your force is going into the knee pad, and the front foot is really providing positive force. Like when you think about the grip for the front foot, you know, there's a reason why you have that grip there, so you can make sure that the forces at the feet are going forward as much as possible and not down, because going down is going to push the boat into the water and increase the resistance, whereas a forward foot force, just relying on the friction of the grip pad there to keep it from slipping, is helping make sure that the forces on the boat are pushing us forward as much as possible. So hopefully I've covered as many of those topics as possible. Yeah, as we said before, having the major muscle groups being in a strong position, hence the A-frame, and being in a strong position when you come to the catch is very important. So hopefully I've covered as many of the sort of words that really jumped out from me from the CKC documents as possible, to provide a rationale to them. As you probably noticed, the running theme about the way I discussed them is bringing them all back to how they affect the interaction between the blade and the water, and the combination and the direction of forces and magnitudes and timing of the interaction between the athlete and the boat and the paddle. Those are the overriding messages. So what I'm going to talk about now is this slide gives a bit of familiarity to a lot of reports that you've probably seen before for many of you. What we're looking at here is a race as a whole. So we're looking at more of a 30,000 overview of the whole performance, and here we're looking at velocity in red, so the boat speed there, and the stroke rate. So this is more of like a performance analysis tool where we're looking at the race as a whole, so you can see what happens at the start in comparison to the end, in comparison to the middle, and provide some key bits of data here, like average stroke velocity, average stroke rate, things like that, to help us understand the performance. But we're here. I wanted to give you an idea about a key performance metric right from the highest level, so level 1 of performance. If you remember, when we look in deterministic models, we look at levels in terms of contributors to performance, and this is the highest level. So this will probably be useful for many of you when you're sort of getting familiar with looking at the performance as a whole. And then what we might do is look into the next level down as we drill into performance a little bit more. So this is actually a report type from a different sport. This is actually rowing, but it was just a nice way of presenting the data to prove my point. Velocity, so average over the whole race, and then instantaneous velocity, what's going on at a specific moment in time. So this is instantaneous velocity here on the right, okay? And this is many strokes all put over the top of each other. So for them, their blade goes in here, blade goes out in here. So this is the power phase, and this is the recovery phase. So you're looking at all the strokes on top of each other. And it's nice to be able to do this because then you can see the cyclical patterns. And if they were to make a change in one particular part of the stroke, then you times that by however many 100 times they're doing that in a race. You make one improvement in one part of the stroke, and you times that by however many 100, and there's your performance improvement. So this is why we want to look at instantaneous velocity or intra-stroke velocity. And then the next level down from pretty basic mathematics. So there's the velocity here, and then the next level down is acceleration. Your A there, change in speed over change in time, and it's important to keep the boat accelerating as much as possible or increasing velocity. And this graph here is it happening exactly the same time as this graph here. So with the blade going in here and coming out here, and anything over the red dotted line is the boat picking up speed, and anything below it is boat losing speed. So we can really see where in the stroke the athletes are good at making sure their boat is picking up speed and making sure you're minimizing losing speed. Because if you're picking up acceleration, then you're affecting your velocity, okay? And that's what we want to do. That's the main aim of it. And so you now have a good understanding of sort of the next level down from average velocity into instantaneous velocity or intra-stroke, and then into acceleration. And acceleration is really nice because it's not only linked to velocity, it's also linked to technique in many ways because of its interaction with force. So we force being mass times acceleration, and so we have our acceleration and we have our mass there, and so now we see the whole net system force, and that's really getting into technique now. And so if you can improve one bit of your technique, then as we said, you multiply it over a few hundred times, and you'll get yourself a much quicker finish time. So the next level down that I really want to get, and I just started talking about acceleration and forces. So this is an acceleration profile from Canoe, and this is so there, as I've already discussed, the acceleration or how a boat responds to an input, and the input being force. So you can see, with the zero line being here, you can see with the blade going in here, you can see how the boat responds to the power phase and how it responds to when the blade's out of the water. And we're looking for the boat to be accelerating for as much as possible, for as long as possible. well, actually in an ideal world, it would sort of, anyway. So it's sort of a theoretical curve, which is pretty much impossible. But this is actually quite a good curve. I can't remember the athlete. I think it would have been an opti level athlete, and the shape of this profile depends on the stroke rate a lot. So I'm not going to sit here and say this is a good or a bad one. Really, the main point was to point out that you can see from the acceleration profile within a stroke, and you can see that each of these dotted lines is one stroke, and then the thick one is the average. So you can see on average how it's responding to the input forces, and the variation. You can see how many strokes there is in here. There was, there's 19 strokes in this data sample. So we can see how the boat is responding to and accelerating within a stroke from the input forces. And therefore, based on the previous slide, you'll be given that you can calculate velocity from acceleration, we can start to see how the boat's velocity is responding within a stroke. So this is really an indicator of technique. Now we're going to look at the same thing for kayak. Side, or the red side being left and the blue side being the right side. You can see the breakdown here. So it's a very different profile of stroke, and we get a really nice grasp with the blade actually going in here, the vertical blade position being here, and the blade coming out of the water here, and this being the air phase. You can see how the boat is responding to the various inputs it's getting, and there was, this was a bigger data sample of 33 strokes on each side. You can see how the boat is responding at different aspects or at different points in the stroke, and you can see where the athlete's doing well and doing not so well. So you can see that this athlete sort of connects reasonably well here. But one of their main areas that I had already actually pointed out was the right side was not responding as well as we might like towards the end of the power phase, and I'm saying the force comes off of the system, and most likely off of the paddle at this point due to various technique issues. So this is a really nice way of sort of describing this sort of level down from. Remember the top level being boat average velocity. Now we've sort of dug down a little bit. And actually we can dig down a little bit more because not quite so readily available as the previous report I gave you, which is something that's pretty standard practice for biomechanics support with you guys. This one is less so. We've got a little bit of equipment that can do this, and it's more on a case study basis. But what we can see is the next level down of input into boat acceleration, and this is identifying the power and force on the paddle in kayak. So with the three main contact points being paddle, bum, and feet, where the athlete could affect the system. This is measuring the key one of paddle force. And so what we have here is the pushing hand and the pulling hand on the right side being blue and the left side being green. We can see how much force they're applying with that hand at any given point in the stroke. So we can see the various differences between left and right. The main aim isn't to do a technical diagnosis here. The main aim is just to point out that you can see, or we can work out what's happening to the different contributors to overall performance by digging down into different things and measuring different things. So it's measuring force, it's measuring the time this is occurring at, so the stroke time. And therefore it's also measuring power. So you can see the left is creating more power on the paddle than the right side is. Now the three things this doesn't look at what the bum and the feet are doing, which would create overall net system force or acceleration, and it doesn't tell you about blade slip. So you might be putting all this force on, but it will only infer blade slip by the shape of the graph here. It won't actually tell you or quantify how much of the stroke you've lost to the blade not gripping onto the water. But the main point was to show next level down into key inputs of that contribute to performance. So hopefully I've given you a really good, or at least a really useful, I should say, underpinning and gone through a lot of the key mechanical principles of canoe and kayak to really make sure we're all on the same page going into the testing presentation. Some homework I wanted to give you guys, other than really going through this presentation to make sure you have a thorough understanding. That would be my first thing that I would want you to achieve before we talk next. But some of the key things we sort of covered, I'd really like you to go and take a look at the CKC guidelines document on the CKC website. It's under coaching resources, and you'll be able to find it pretty easily. I want you to retake a look at a bunch of these slides and make sure you've got a really good idea about what the mechanical variables are that impact performance. But then once you've got that, it'd be great if you could start really thinking about what you would want to learn from your group, your athlete group, what you would want to measure from them, why. For example, what do you think is limiting their performance when you think about the hierarchy of things that affect performance? And think about how those things are relevant to performance. Is this something you've got a hunch about? Or when you think about it from a physics point of view, is it something that really does actually impact performance? And then, the most important thing about all of this sort of stuff is then how you would implement it and how you would use those findings to educate training. Because all this is just interesting until you cross that barrier, because it has to answer the so what question. You have to be able to look at performance or a metric and say, is it interesting or is it useful? Can you take those findings and make it impactful by educating training? And that's what I mean by passing the so what test. So someone has a force profile of whatever, so what? Is that important? Is it relevant at this point? I'm just picking any old thing that you can measure and ask that question to it and make sure that whatever it is that you're interested in about and or that you might want to measure or that you understand impacts performance, that you can actually implement and you can educate training from and you can affect performance from. So a lot of the variables that we were talking about before, they all impact performance, but what can you do about it? Making sure that you're making training decisions that take that information into consideration to help the athlete. Hopefully I've been clear enough. This is my first effort at doing a presentation like this, talking to myself here. Hopefully it's made sense to you. Probably a bit dry, and I'm really looking forward to getting back into the DTE with you guys as quickly as possible to add a face to this and a bit more personal dynamics, and we can really discuss all these points together. I'm really happy to talk to individuals to go through their ideas if they've got any queries. So there's the take-home messages. I'm pretty sure I've really already covered them, to be honest. Don't need to round them home too much more. But the main one is boat speed is an outcome, and there's an underpinning hierarchy of mechanical inputs and outputs that affect it, all to which are varying levels. And it's working out which one's the most important to you guys, knowing your athletes and what you think is their limitations to, or current limitations to, improving. And yeah, if you have any questions, please email me at that address, and I'll be happy to arrange a bit of a chat, go through anything you want to make sure you've got a really good idea of this going into our next talk, and hopefully a really useful end of summer's work if we can possibly do it. Looking forward to it all, and we'll be in contact soon. Thank you very much for your attention, and all the best.